The medical file in my hands proves my entire life is a lie. My father lunges, trying to rip it away, his fingers digging into my skin like claws. I shove him back, the gravel biting into my knees as I scramble for the truth. The basement safe holds answers, but the key is buried in his pocket. One wrong move, and the last 30 years stay locked away forever. I pin him down, his breath ragged against the driveway. The contract inside isn't from an agency. It's a private sale. My parents didn't adopt me. They bought me. And the neighbors across the street, they're the ones who sold me. The manila folder lay crumpled against a damp tire track, its edges curling under the morning mist of Oak Ridge. Ethan Miller retrieved the document, his thumb smearing a drop of condensation across the bold header. Clinical pathology report. He traced the lines of text until his breath hitched. Typo negative. The paper crinkled in his grip, a sharp, rhythmic sound against the quiet suburban street. He looked up at the house he had lived in for 30 years, a structure he had measured 1,000 times, only to realize the foundation was built on a sinkhole of lies. Ethan's boots crunched on the gravel as he marched toward the garage. The smell of freshly shorn grass, that cloying, wet scent of suburban perfection, stuck to the back of his throat. Robert Miller stood by the open garage, a wrench clutched in one grease-stained hand. He didn't look up as Ethan approached, but his jaw tightened, a hard, jagged line reflecting the rigid geometry of the driveway. Ethan thrust the folder toward his father's chest. The paper fluttered, a white flag in the gray light. Typo, Dad. Ethan's voice rasped, stripping away the practiced calm of his morning routine. You and Mom are both AB. It's physically impossible. The math doesn't reconcile. Robert wiped his palms on a tattered rag, the fabric snagging on his calluses. He stared at the driveway, his eyes flat and unreadable. He didn't reach for the file. Instead, he tossed the wrench onto the workbench. The metal clattered against the concrete, echoing off the hollow walls of the garage. Biology is a messy business, Ethan. Robert finally turned, his voice like gravel hitting a tin roof. Some secrets exist to keep a roof over your head. Put that paper away before you catch a draft. Robert lunged suddenly, his heavy hand snapping out like a hydraulic press to snatch the folder. Ethan stepped back, his internal compass already calculating the distance to the edge of the property. He pivoted, tucking the file under his arm. The physical desperation in Robert's eyes confirmed the terror. This wasn't just a medical anomaly. It was a breach in the structural integrity of their entire lives. Ethan retreated toward his car, the silver architectural scale in his pocket tapping against his thigh. A rhythmic reminder that the truth had a specific, measurable weight. The front door of the Miller residence groaned open, and Claire stepped out onto the porch. She looked at Ethan, then at Robert, her soft face tightening with an all-too-familiar anxiety. She began to mirror Ethan's posture, leaning slightly forward as if trying to catch his balance for him. Ethan, honey, what's going on? We're okay, you know. It's just a misunderstanding, right? Her verbal validation loop spun like a failing motor. She stepped into the driveway, her heels clicking against the asphalt. Come inside. We can fix this, you know. Let's just talk. Ethan ignored her, his mind racing through the floor plans of the house. He knew there was a discrepancy. He remembered the crawl space from when he was 7, the one that didn't appear on the official blueprints. If the blood work was a lie, then the birth certificate in the upstairs office was likely a forgery. He pushed past Claire, his shoulder brushing hers. The smell of her floral perfume mixed with the scent of burnt oil from the garage. A nauseating cocktail of domesticity and deceit. I need to see the original records. Ethan muttered, his voice clipped and metronomic. The clearance in the hallway is 36 inches. Move, Claire. He stormed into the house, the heavy Victorian architecture pressing down on him. The air inside felt 10 degrees colder, a bone-deep chill that made his breath mist in the foyer. Claire followed him, her voice rising in a desperate plea. Ethan, please, you're ransacking the place. Robert, help me. Ethan was already in the study, tearing through the mahogany desk. He pulled out drawers, dumping stacks of tax returns and property deeds onto the Persian rug. The sound of sliding wood and fluttering paper filled the room. He wasn't looking for sentiment. He was looking for the 0 point, the original corner of the foundation where the lie began. Claire grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Stop it. You're breaking things, Ethan. We can just be the husband and wife we were yesterday, right? You know we can. He flung her hand off, his eyes scanning the gaps behind the drawers. He moved to the bedroom, throwing open the closet doors. He felt the walls, knocking for the hollow sound of a hidden void. Every second he spent searching, the pressure in his chest grew. He wasn't a son. He was an occupant in a space he didn't own. The sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoed from the stairs. Robert was coming. Ethan dived for the nightstand, ripping the back panel away. Nothing. He turned to leave, but Robert was already in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the egress. That's enough, Robert growled. You're acting like a tenant who's lost his mind. Give me the keys to your car and sit down. Ethan didn't wait for the lecture. He charged, using his shoulder to find the center of gravity in Robert's chest. They spilled out of the bedroom and onto the landing, then down the stairs in a blurred tumble of limbs and muffled grunts. They burst through the front door and out onto the gravel driveway. The struggle was raw and ugly. Robert was older, but he had the strength of a man who had spent 40 years pouring concrete and swinging hammers. He tackled Ethan into the sharp stones of the driveway. Ethan felt the gravel bite into his cheek, the metallic taste of blood filling his mouth as his lips split against his teeth. You think you want the truth? Robert hissed, pinning Ethan's wrists into the dirt. The truth is a hole you don't want to fall into. I built this life for you. I bought the dirt. I raised the walls. Ethan bucked, his legs finding purchase against the underside of his father's heavy torso. He twisted, the silver scale falling from his pocket and glinting in the harsh sunlight. With a guttural yell, Ethan threw his weight to the left, unbalancing the older man. He scrambled on top, his knees digging into Robert's shoulders. He reached into Robert's pocket, his fingers closing around a heavy brass ring of keys. You didn't build it for me. Ethan panted, staring down at the man who had raised him. You built it to contain me? He stood up, clutching the keys, his chest heaving. Robert lay in the gravel, his chest rising and falling like a bellows. He didn't get up. He just watched Ethan with flat, defeated eyes. Ethan turned and ran toward the back of the house, toward the basement door. He knew which key it was, the one with the square head, the one Robert never let him touch. Subverted beat 1.4. Ethan fumbled with the square-headed key, his hands shaking so violently the brass clattered against the lock's faceplate. He forced himself to breathe, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. The lock yielded with a heavy, oily click. He swung the basement door open and descended into the dark. The air smelled of scorched dust and old furnace filters. He reached the bottom and moved toward the far corner, behind the heavy water heater. There, bolted to the concrete floor, sat a small, fireproof safe. He used the second key on the ring. The safe door groaned as it swung open on rusted hinges. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was the moment of clarity. He expected to find a hidden adoption decree from a reputable agency, or perhaps a letter from a biological mother who couldn't keep him. He wanted a narrative he could reconcile, a story of a rescued child. His fingers brushed a thick, yellowed parchment. He pulled it out. It wasn't a government form. It was a handwritten contract dated 32 years ago. At the top, in Robert's heavy, blocky script, were the words, Asset Transfer Agreement. Ethan's eyes scanned the lines. In exchange for the sum of $50,000 and the full discharge of all outstanding debts related to the Oak Ridge Development Project, the undersigned agreed to transfer custody of the male infant. Ethan felt the floor tilt. He leaned against the cold concrete wall to keep from collapsing. He kept reading, looking for the names of the undersigned. His eyes hit the bottom of the page, and his breath stopped. There, in faded blue ink, were the signatures. Robert Miller, David Thompson, Sarah Thompson. The names vibrated on the page. The Thompsons, the people who lived 60 feet away, the people who had waved at him from across the street for 3 decades, the neighbors who had attended his birthday parties and watched him play in the sprinklers. A wave of relief washed over him for a fleeting second. He wasn't alone. His parents were right there. He could just walk across the street and find the real family he had always dreamed of. He could leave the Millers and their cold, measured world behind. He pictured Sarah Thompson's kind smile, the way she always offered him lemonade when he was a kid. He felt a surge of hope. This was the fix. He had found the source. He tucked the document into his jacket and climbed the stairs, his mind already mapping out the conversation. He would walk across the street, show them the paper, and they would embrace him. They would explain that they had stayed close to watch over him. It was a sacrifice, not a crime. He stepped out into the sunlight. Robert was standing by the garage, watching him. Ethan didn't say a word. He didn't even look at the man. He walked straight across the asphalt of the street, his eyes fixed on the Victorian gables of the Thompson house. He reached their front porch and pounded on the door. "David! Sarah! Open up!" He heard movement inside. The heavy curtains twitched. Then the door opened a crack. David Thompson peered out, his skin looking like crumpled parchment. He looked at the paper in Ethan's hand, then up at Ethan's face. There was no warmth, no recognition of a long-lost son. There was only a cold, sharpening terror. "Get off my porch," David whispered. "David, I found it," Ethan said, his voice trembling with a desperate, misplaced optimism. "I know who I am. I'm your son. We can end this now." David's face contorted into something ugly. "You aren't my son. You're a debt that was paid. If you don't leave, I'm calling the police. You're trespassing, Ethan. You're a Miller. Stay on your side of the road." The door slammed shut. Ethan heard the heavy thud of the deadbolt sliding into place. He stood on the porch, the contract in his hand. The asset transfer agreement suddenly felt like lead. He looked back at his own house, then at the Thompsons' closed door. He wasn't a child who had been found. He was a piece of property that had been sold, and neither side wanted the return of the merchandise. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach, leaving him gasping in the stagnant suburban air. Ethan stood on the Thompsons' porch, the silence of the neighborhood ringing in his ears. He hammered on the door again, the wood vibrating under his fist. "David, open the door. You can't just shut me out. I have the paper. I have the proof." Inside, he heard the frantic pacing of feet on hardwood. A moment later, the sharp, electronic chirp of a telephone being dialed echoed through the thin walls. Ethan's architectural mind automatically calculated the response time of the local precinct. 4 minutes, given the morning traffic. He was on a clock. "I'm calling them, Ethan." David's voice muffled through the door, cracked and hysterical. "I'm telling them you're violent. You're trespassing. Get away from my family." Ethan backed away, his boots hitting the porch steps with a hollow thud. He looked at the Thompson house, the dark stained wood, the Victorian windows that looked like unblinking eyes. For 30 years, he had lived in the shadow of this house, never knowing that the people inside were his own blood, and that they had watched him grow up like a specimen in a jar. The betrayal felt like a structural failure, a collapse of the very ground beneath him. He retreated to the edge of the Thompsons' lawn, hidden behind a thick hedge of overgrown boxwoods. He needed to think. He needed data. He pulled out his phone and accessed his private bank records, a habit born of his obsession with tracking every cent and square inch of his life. He began to cross-reference his college fund deposits, those anonymous gifts that had appeared every semester like clockwork. His fingers flew across the screen. He pulled up the public records for David Thompson's retirement account. The numbers began to align. Every time Ethan received a $5,000 scholarship payment, David Thompson had made an identical withdrawal from his meager pension fund. The math was undeniable. Robert Miller hadn't just bought a son. He had forced the biological father to pay for the son's upbringing. It was a double taxation of the soul. Robert was the owner, and David was the maintenance crew. Ethan felt a surge of nausea. His entire education, his career, his very existence was a financial loop designed to keep both families tethered to a crime. A black SUV pulled onto the street, its engine a low, predatory hum. Ethan froze. He recognized the vehicle. It was the one that had sat at the end of his block for as long as he could remember. James Murphy, his father's security consultant, stepped out. Murphy was a man built like a concrete pillar, with a neck that looked like it belonged to a statue. He stood with his arms crossed, maintaining a 5-foot buffer zone as he scanned the lawn. "Ethan," Murphy called out, his voice a low, gravelly drone. "Your father wants you to come home. You're making a scene. The neighbors are starting to look." "I'm not going back, James," Ethan said, stepping out from behind the hedge. "I know about the agreement. I know what you've been guarding all these years." Murphy didn't argue. He began to hum, a low, tuneless funeral dirge that vibrated in the air. He started to move toward Ethan, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Ethan knew he couldn't win a physical fight with Murphy. He needed to disappear. He turned and ran toward the back of the Thompsons' property. He knew the layout of the neighborhood better than anyone. He had mapped the drainage systems during the summer of his 16th year. He reached the edge of the woods and slid down a steep embankment into a concrete culvert. The air inside the tunnel was cool and smelled of damp earth and rusted iron. The rhythmic splashing of water echoed from deep within the pipes. Ethan crouched, his architectural scale catching on his jacket. He moved quickly, navigating the narrow passages with the ease of a man who understood the skeletal structure of the world. Above him, he could hear the muffled shouts of the police and the heavy tread of Murphy's boots on the metal grates. He reached a junction where the pipes narrowed. He squeezed through, the cold concrete biting into his shoulders. He was deep beneath the neighborhood now, in the dark voids that the blueprints always ignored. He found a small alcove near a rusted garden shed on the edge of the Thompsons' property line. Inside the shed, tucked beneath a pile of rotted burlap sacks, he found a rusted metal box. He pried it open. Inside were stacks of old correspondence, letters between Robert Miller and a man named Dr. Thomas Bennett. Ethan's eyes scanned the letters. "The transfer is complete," one read. "But the doctor is becoming a liability. He's asking for more hush money to keep the birth certificate out of the state records. I've handled it. He's been moved to a facility in the Midwest. He won't be coming back." Ethan leaned back against the damp wood of the shed. It wasn't just a sale. It was a kidnapping facilitated by a corrupt doctor who had been paid to evaporate. Robert Miller hadn't saved Ethan from poverty. He had engineered a void and filled it with a stolen life. The adoption was a calculated abduction, a theft of identity that spanned 3 decades. The sound of a siren wailed in the distance, a sharp, mournful cry that echoed through the trees. Ethan realized he was no longer just a man looking for his parents. He was a witness to a 30-year conspiracy. He looked at the letters in his hand, then at the Thompson house. The theater was falling apart, and the actors were starting to scream. Ethan spent the next hour in the shadows of a derelict construction site 3 blocks away. The skeletal frame of a half-finished luxury home rose above him, its raw timber smelling of pine and sawdust. He sat on a stack of drywall, his head in his hands. The world felt like a blueprint that had been folded too many times. The lines were blurred, the measurements no longer made sense. A soft footfall on the plywood floor made him look up. Claire was standing there, her face pale in the twilight. She had followed him. She looked around the empty, echoing space, her hands trembling. "Ethan, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The police are at the house. Robert he's furious, but he's scared too. Just come home. We can tell them it was a mental break. We can fix this, you know. Right?" Ethan looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the way she mirrored his slumped posture, the way she sought validation in every breath. She was part of the structure, a piece of furniture meant to make the lie look comfortable. "There is no home, Claire," Ethan said, his voice flat. "There's just a building with a lot of hidden rooms. You knew, didn't you? On some level, you knew the math didn't add up." "I just wanted us to be happy," she cried, her voice echoing off the raw studs. "Does it matter where you came from if the life we have is good? You know it's good, right?" Ethan stood up, his posture rigid. "It matters when the life is a debt someone else paid. Go back to Robert, Claire. Tell him the architect is off the clock." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the hollow shell of the house. He headed toward the local park, a vast, lonely expanse of grass and rusted swing sets. He knew where Sarah Thompson went when she wanted to be alone. He had seen her there every Tuesday for years, sitting on the same bench, staring at the woods. He found her under the rotunda, her heavy gold jewelry clinking as she adjusted her coat. She looked up as he approached, her eyes cold and calculating. She didn't look like a mother. She looked like a woman who was constantly checking the exits. "You've caused a lot of trouble today, Ethan," she said, her voice sharp. "I want the truth, Sarah. Not the version you told the neighbors, not the version you told yourself. Why did you do it?" Before she could answer, a roar of an engine shattered the silence. A black SUV barreled across the grass, its tires tearing up the manicured turf. Robert Miller was behind the wheel, his face a mask of rage. He didn't slow down. He steered the massive vehicle straight toward Ethan's parked truck at the edge of the trail, the metal crunching with a sickening, grinding scream as he rammed it. Robert leaped out of the SUV, a heavy tire iron clutched in his hand. He looked like a madman, his eyes bloodshot, his breathing a ragged growl. You're destroying everything, Robert screamed, swinging the iron. I gave you a name. I gave you a future. Ethan stepped inside the swing, his architectural training allowing him to see the arc of the weapon before it hit. He grabbed Robert's wrist, the cold metal of the tire iron brushing his knuckles. They grappled on the park trail, the smell of scorched rubber and gasoline hanging in the air. Ethan was younger, faster. He used his weight to twist Robert's arm, the tire iron clattering onto the asphalt. He shoved the older man back, leaving him breathless and defeated on the ground. Sarah Thompson stood by the bench, her face finally breaking. She began to scrub her hands together, a rhythmic, aggressive motion, as if she were trying to wash something off her skin. "We had to!" she shrieked, her voice piercing the quiet park. David owed him everything. The construction firm, the house, the debt. Robert said he'd put David in prison if we didn't give him what he wanted. He wanted a legacy, and we needed a way out. Ethan froze. "You traded me? To settle a construction debt?" "You were the only thing of value we had left," Sarah sobbed, her hands turning red from the scrubbing. We thought if you were right across the street, it wouldn't be like you were gone. But it was worse. Every day, watching you live our life in his house. It was a transaction, Ethan. That's all it ever was." Ethan stood paralyzed. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, the blue and red lights flickering through the trees. He looked at Robert, who was struggling to sit up, and then at Sarah, who was still washing her invisible sins. He wasn't a son. He wasn't a rescued child. He was collateral, a human payment for a failed business deal. The realization was a crushing blow, a final collapse of the world he had tried so hard to measure and understand. The police arrived in a flurry of slamming doors and shouting voices. Officer Kevin Walker, a young man with a face that looked too eager for the gravity of the scene, approached Ethan with his handcuffs out. Ethan didn't resist. He felt the cold steel bite into his wrists, a physical weight that finally matched the heaviness in his chest. "Ethan Miller, you're under arrest for trespassing and assault," Walker said, his thumb picking at his cuticle until it bled. "Officer," Ethan said, his voice calm and precise. "Before you take me in, I want you to look at something. I'm an architect. I know how buildings are put together." He directed Walker's attention to the gables of the Miller and Thompson houses, visible over the tree line. If you check the attics of both homes, you'll find a series of structural modifications. High-end surveillance equipment hardwired into a shared system. It's been there for 30 years. It's not just a neighborly dispute. It's a conspiracy. Subverted Beat 4.2. At the precinct, the air smelled of stale coffee and floor wax. Ethan sat in the interrogation room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were observing his own life from a distance. He waited for the detective to come in and tell him that his biological parents had been coerced, that they had loved him and were victims of Robert's power. He clung to the hope that Sarah's confession in the park was an outburst of stress, not the whole truth. He needed to believe there was at least one good parent in this equation. Officer Walker entered, carrying a laptop. He looked somber. "We found something in the Thompsons' files. A recorded confession Sarah made to her lawyer years ago, just in case Robert ever turned on them. You should see this." He turned the screen toward Ethan. The video was grainy, dated 15 years back. Sarah Thompson sat in a dark office, her eyes sharp and predatory. "David didn't want to do it?" Sarah's voice came through the speakers, cold and calculating. "He was ready to go to prison for the debt. But I saw an opportunity. Robert was desperate for a son to take over the firm. He's obsessed with legacy. I told him we'd give him the boy if he gave us the deed to the house and a monthly stipend. I negotiated the price, not Robert. I realized that if we sold Ethan, we'd be set for life. I told David it was for the boy's own good, but really I just didn't want to be poor again. I'd do it again in a heartbeat. A child is a temporary asset. A house is forever. Ethan felt the world tilt. The hope he had nurtured, the idea that he had a real mother who had been forced into a terrible choice, evaporated. Sarah wasn't a victim. She was the architect of the deal. She had used him as a bargaining chip to secure her country club membership and her Victorian home. She had looked at her own infant son and seen a way to pay off a mortgage. The betrayal hit him harder than Robert's tackle, harder than the tire iron. He realized that both families were identical. They were all predators, and he was the only prey. There was no good side to go to. He was the product of a transaction between two equally corrupt parties. He felt a cold, hollow peace settle over him. The measurements were finally complete. The math was 0. He looked at Walker. I want to see them, all of them, together. The meeting took place in a sterile conference room. Robert, Sarah, and David sat on one side of the table. Robert tried to straighten the salt shakers on the table, his hands shaking. Sarah was silent, her eyes fixed on her own reflection in the window. David just stared at his shoes. Ethan stood at the head of the table. He didn't offer a greeting. He pulled out a stack of legal documents he had prepared with a lawyer during his hour of hiding. You're all going to sign these, Ethan said, his voice a low, steady drone. These are deeds of gift. You are signing over both of your properties and all the assets in the college fund to the Oak Ridge Children's Shelter. You have 1 hour to vacate. If you don't sign, I hand the surveillance logs and the sale agreement to the district attorney. Kidnapping and human trafficking carry a heavy sentence, Robert, even for a man with your connections. Robert looked up, his jaw tightening. You'd destroy our legacy? Everything I built? You didn't build anything, Robert, Ethan said. You just moved dirt around to hide the bodies. Sign the papers. One by one, they signed. The scratching of the pen was the only sound in the room. When it was over, Ethan took the documents and walked out. He didn't look back. He didn't want their apologies or their explanations. They were just structures that had been condemned. He walked out to his truck, which had been towed to the precinct. The side was crushed, the metal screaming as he opened the door. He sat in the driver's seat and looked at the manila folder on the dashboard. Clinical pathology report. He started the engine and drove out of Oak Ridge. He passed the manicured lawns, the uniform mailboxes, and the street lights with their missing glass casings. He reached the highway and headed toward Chicago. As the skyline of the city rose in the distance, a chaotic, beautiful mess of steel and glass, Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He looked in the rearview mirror at the fading lights of the suburbs. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to measure the distance. He didn't care about the floor plans or the hidden voids. He was no longer an asset. He was no longer collateral. He was just a man driving into the dark, finally free to build something of his own. The theater was closed, the play was over, and for Ethan Miller, the world was finally, perfectly, immeasurable.